Good morning, everyone in London and in Europe, and good afternoon to all of you who are following us from Asia. So, on behalf of the Spanish Chamber of Commerce in the United Kingdom, I just want to start by thanking OMFIF for hosting the event on renewable. There's some thoughts with we all, and even more delighted to do so with our friends at the British Embassy in Madrid, who also participate in this event, and as well as the members of the panel, who no doubt will enrich us later with their views. The study of climate change is an unavoidable reality, which will be with us for many generations to come. And indeed, this has compelled, I believe, rethinking of the way we climate change. But the impact, just think of, for example, the impact of raising sea levels in our tourism, the increased frequency of severe droughts impacting our agriculture, or more frequent wildfires affecting our landscape and rural communities. Just think for a moment the importance of our agricultural exports for a country like Spain, for the Spanish economy, but also for the final consumer, very often a British household. Climate change, we know this is a global priority, and which, no doubt we cannot fight alone. And global initiatives like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Principles for Responsible Investments, or the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure attest to that. And of course, Agenda 2030, driven by the UN. I think it's important and fair to recognize that environmental, social, and governance issues have fallen down the agenda of large investors this year as they grapple with the consequences of the pandemic and subsequent economic downturn. However, this is an extraordinary opportunity to rethink our economy. It's not a coincidence that Her Majesty's government and the US President-elect both used the expression "build back better" to refer to this opportunity I mentioned. Be it the British Level Up programs, the European Next Generations EU, or the upcoming Biden administration stimulus package, it all will be green in the core. However, I do want to nevertheless just make a point of caution, and I think, and I'll be very, very curious for the panelists' thoughts. And I think we all should be wary of those who, from the investment, are actually making a real or substantial difference. We must shy away from greenwashing. And I'll be very curious about whether this is discussed in the panel and what the thoughts are. There have been, so curious about your thoughts, to determine what green finance or what sustainable is, and how investors are getting what they actually think they're getting. That to me is one of the important points we should be discussing. I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on whether the EU regulation on taxonomy, which is one of the pillars of the European Union's sustainable finance and climate change agenda, and which forms part of a wider initiative, is actually having an impact. Or to rephrase the question, is it actually helping investors and businesses to access and to assess whether the economic activities are indeed green and sustainable? The two serious impacts on the carbon footprint. The energy sector is obviously at the core of this effort, and it is where renewable energy plays a pivotal role, both Spain and the United Kingdom are countries that have been power or offshore wind, but there's much more we can do together. The future energy landscape will be less based on fossil fuels and more decentralized. This will require substantial investment and technological advances for getting renewable energies to achieve grid parity with respect to fossil fuel energies across the board. And for managing the decentralized network, running a system where many of the energy sources have non-constant generation patterns. So this is something I'm also curious to hear your thoughts about. The pursuit of cleaner energy framework is definitely not a straight route. I think we know this by now. We all remember the side effects of biofuels can have on food prices, for example, or those debates on whether a new generation of nuclear reactors will play a role in our economies. Energy has traditionally been one of the strongest and most regulated sectors. In this current context of the departure from the United Kingdom from the European Union, I think it's worth thinking whether we expect divergence from the European Union and the UK when it comes to energy. I think this will be actually a very healthy debate. Corporations have also a responsibility in transitioning to a greener world, and we're pleased at the Chamber to actually have a substantial number of those companies. Retail, for example, often happens online on big malls outside the city center, where substantial carbon footprint is in the form of delivery and transportation of goods are sold. This is also a part of the debate. I think we've seen in the Kingdom and Spain have endless possibilities of cooperation. And again, I do hope we touch upon this during the debate on the panel. And these possibilities span from investment to project development, technology sharing, and joint research. The shared acumen and expertise in the area is something that it should be definitely emphasized, and which should be the cornerstone in the new phase of this relationship that Spain and the UK will be having. Whatever the shape Brexit takes, the planet is not going to wait, and both countries, as I said, have plenty of opportunities to work together. Many of the examples of companies that are heavily involved in the sector in both countries, I mean, think of Siemens, Gamesa, Iberdrola, and the UK subsidiary Scottish Power, Acciona, are extremely active members of the Spanish Chamber of Commerce, and at the same time, leading companies in the world when it comes to renewable energy. We also have the presence on the other side, from the British side, of green network energy. I will conclude by welcoming again this initiative of UNFIF, and in particular the fact that it's taking a bilateral approach. It's not only green finance, not only renewable energy, but it's also the bilateral angle. And I'm delighted that UNFIF is creating this space for dialogue and debate and bringing together both public and private sectors. I think it's great. So I'm certain that we all will enjoy a fruitful discussion, and when things get better, look forward to meeting you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Gracias, a very great introduction on the topics. I'm very pleased now to move on to the panel to discuss all these issues. And as you said, we have an excellent panel, bilateral, both private and public sector, as well as views from the UK and Spain, and also policy-making institutions, the OECD, as well as represented. So very pleased to welcome today to the panel Mark Dufour, energy specialist at the European Investment Bank, Ayush Tandon, policy analyst at Green Finance and Investment at the OECD, Daryl Murphy, Managing Director and Head of Infrastructure for Aviva. Vicky Price, Board Member at the Centre for Economics and Business Research and former Director General for Economics at the UK's Department for Business Innovation and Skills, and also on OMFIF's Advisory Board. And Carlos Zuluaga, Managing Director and Global Head of Energy at BBVA. Welcome to you all. Please put your cameras on. So we've had the scene set by Eduardo, and we are talking today about renewable energy as an asset class and infrastructure as well. We have had a big emphasis on building back better, the sustainable recovery. COVID, of course, has reshifted priorities in policy making, but it has also introduced this urgency in the sense of seeing how vulnerable financial systems are to non-financial sources of risk, and how can we move ahead with that? And the question of supply, of building a pipeline, of sorting out the details in terms of really creating an asset class out of the sustainable areas where investment is needed is a big emphasis. So I look forward to discussing all these issues with you, as well as more granular questions around which technologies are going to be the winners in this situation, given the different scenarios that we may be seeing around the energy transition. So let me start with you, Daryl, on an investor's perspective in terms of where do you see the opportunities and risks in this context of building back better strategies? How do you see the mix between public and private sector in advancing renewable energy as an asset class?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invites. And I'll make a few comments, and hopefully we'll get into perhaps a wider discussion on these important themes. So I'm attempting, I guess, to discuss institutional investor appetite, both from our point of view, but I think I'm fairly aligned to the fact that, you know, for institutional investors, the opportunity around renewable energy has really represented a strong opportunity to align supply and demand. I think Eduardo mentioned the important point that ESG has become absolutely embedded into our investment philosophy. And therefore, there is a very good alignment with renewable energy in the context of ESG. You would have seen increasingly institutional investors making very strong ambitions around their own strategies to achieve net zero within their portfolio investment. I think this is no longer an ancillary kind of part of our investment decision. It's absolutely integrated and core to what we do. So therefore, there's a lot of capital that is available, and obviously trying to channel itself globally into renewable energy. Obviously, the market opportunity is very large, as we're discussing, because everyone needs to shift increasingly towards meeting their own, at a governmental level, their own policies towards low carbon transition. So the supply and demand is good. So therefore, there ought to be a virtuous circle between capital and opportunity. And certainly, as an infrastructure investor, this is the broad sector an exciting part. Now, when we talk about renewable energy, I think a lot of investors will think about existing technologies. So onshore wind, solar, offshore wind, obviously an asset class that really is a great example if we look at Northwest Europe, how that sector's grown to the scale it has today. But it's not without its risks. And I think COVID, the pandemic, has shown that power price risk is a very volatile sort of a feature. That's something investors have recognized. And we're all having to really embrace what we would call the subsidy-free world. Europe in particular has been driven, I think, successfully by the basis of subsidies. They are reducing in many countries, and therefore investors are beginning to have to bridge a gap towards a subsidy-free world. We're seeing greater use of things like corporate PPA structures. So there are risks that historically wouldn't have been there. And the additional risk I'll just end on is new technologies. I referred to the reasonably well-established technologies previously, but we're now excitedly looking ahead towards the use of hydrogen, storage, more complex waste treatments and recycling. There is an endless list of potential new areas for investment. Many of these lack proven ability to deliver at scale, and equally a commercial model if you look at something like hydrogen. So therefore, I think it brings back into play the importance of the role of investors and the public sector and governments to work together to ensure there's the right policy framework and alignment in terms of the investor risk appetite. So I think, discussions such as this are very important and will set the tone going forward for greater collaboration between the public and private sector. But let me stop there, and no doubt we'll come back to some of those themes later on.
Thank you very much, Daryl. Just a couple of follow-up questions on the things you've raised so far. So on the question of supply and demand, and you mentioned that there is a lot more demand now from institutional investors to move in more sustainable investment strategies. What do you think the motivation for that is? Is it more the kind of virtue signaling? There is part of that. There is the regulations coming and the need to appear to be doing something about sustainable finance. Eduardo raised in his introductory remarks also the risk of greenwashing, which is something I'd like us to address in this panel. But to what extent does that create different types of demand? For example, we may be seeing some institutional investors saying that we will take some investment strategies that align with that, but at the same time continue to kind of have a very high carbon footprint in terms of their own energy consumption and their buildings, and kind of how does that match with what they're doing in terms of their investment strategies? To what extent do you see the motivation being a need to protect against these risks in their portfolios, and how is that kind of translating in terms of analyzing scenarios? Because in certain climate scenarios, some forms of renewable energy or some forms of non-renewable energy may be part of the transition and others may not be part. You mentioned some of the examples there of what energy mixes we may be the ideal ones under certain climate scenarios, and we still don't have very certain information about that. So how do you see investors approaching this uncertainty and adjusting their views?
Gosh, there's a lot to go. I'll try and keep this brief then, but to your first point, I think, and it's easy to say this, but I think institutions are acting genuinely at a level of, I think, increasingly corporate demands. I mean, representing, being as part of Viva Investors in the Viva Group, if I look at our example, corporately, we have our own strategy in terms of your points of actually achieving, net zero over a period of time, how we look at our own, you have to get your own house in order, as it were. But in terms of the market opportunity, I think that you can, if you want to take a slightly sort of commercial approach, you can say that renewable energy makes sense from a climate point of view, it makes sense in terms of the transition, but it also offers some very strong investment opportunities. So I think it's a very much a win-win, arguably, on that basis. I don't think that's opportunistic. I think that is just showing good alignment. I think to your point, though, in terms of how we move forward with new technologies, that's the harder one, because we've been in a world where longer term forecasting of energy mix has been reasonably set. I think investors, by the nature of things, are long-term in their outlook, and therefore taking a long-term view on an energy mix that is uncertain is increasingly a challenge. And I think that brings me back to my point about governments. There has to be a government alignment. I will say openly, I'm moving away from the idea of being laissez-faire in market terms. I think increasingly governments are going to have to set greater prescriptive pathways to encourage certain technologies. But it does represent quite a challenge for investors, because as at today, there are a lot of existing investments in solar and wind, which are relatively straightforward. We've seen a large reduction in cost of capital for those asset classes. But in other new technologies, the supply of capital is far less. And I think they're the ones where we need to see greater work between investors and governments to make those investable asset classes.
Great, thanks. And I'm sure we'll have a long discussion about that also. And a reminder to our audience to also start sending your questions as panelists speak. We'll address those at the end. But let me turn to you, Carlos, now to talk a little bit about, we've heard from Daryl about the role of governments. How do you see the market structures evolving in the area of renewable energy, and also some of these issues around, especially also in terms of the storage of energy and the kind of risk and...
Hello?
Yes, can you hear me?
Return.
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Okay, thank you very much for this kind invitation, and happy just to share some thoughts about this pretty, let's say, relevant topic. And as you have said, a lot of topics to be discussed during our panel. But going to your questions and your comments, just to frame a bit the discussion, I think that there is a clear understanding that the net zero target is going to be there for a long time. So I think that the European Union, UK, other geographies like China in 2060 are committed to meet this target. And that means a lot of investment to be done during this period of time. We can discuss later on about technologies. And one of the key points that you have raised is this topic about the risk return, and what is the involvement of the public, let's say, investments and the public funds into this equation. For me, that's the key question. Every party tries to get a fair return on their risk that they are assuming. It's clear that there is a lot of capex to be implemented. It's clear that there has been a significant decrease in the cost per megawatts in any generation technology, but it's also clear that there is an increasing risk of uncertainty about the future generation mix, as it has been mentioned before. And that means that there could be some merchant risk at the end of at the tail, let's say, of any investment. And that means that how you are going to assume that pricing in your different models, how we are going to put that in your pricing model when you decide a final decision to invest in either through a PPA that at the end would last for 10, 15 years, shorter for sure than the useful life of any generation asset, or in any tender. There has been a lot of debate about what has been the assumptions used for the winning players in the different tenders, because as you have seen, the pricing that has been obtained in the different tenders have been quite low. And really, we can say that there is a grid parity and there is no subsidy at all in these renewable technologies. And we can mention not only the PV and the onshore wind, but eventually the offshore, we have seen in the UK or in France in the latest tenders. Other thing is that there is a need for new technology advances. It's clear, and there is larger wind turbines every time, more efficient panels in the PV technology. That needs also to be, let's say, understood and assumed by the different investors and financing forces, banking sector as well, in terms of assuming this technological risk that at the end is also critical in order to provide cheap financing. But it's something that is going to be there. And obviously there are other technologies that would be required. You mentioned the storage. One of the key weaknesses of the renewable energy is the intermittencies, in the sense that you don't have security of supply when the demand is there. And storage is a basic for making the system, the transmission also system and the distribution system stable, ensuring that you would have the energy available when you need it. And how you are going to deal with this storage alternative, meaning batteries or potentially pumping hydro generation technology, is therefore debate, because what are the economics also of those investments? They used to be in the past the difference in between peak hours and the bottom of the day hours. And for me, that's the key point, is how to ensure that we can share some maybe public funding into these new technologies, into these new storage required investments, just to ensure that we can continue on one side with these, let's say, subsidies-free technologies like the onshore, offshore, or PV, but also we complement that with the support of the public fund for hydrogen or storage and some of the sources that we would need, because at the end, what is clear is that we need all of them for the future.
Great, thanks very much, Carlos, and especially on the issues around the kind of public and private sector and how they can work together. This was a very key part of the discussion that we had also, again, with the British Embassy in Madrid a couple of weeks ago on resilient and sustainable infrastructure and how we can get the right mix of public and private partnerships. And a lot of the issues that you've raised in terms of the risk, the technology risk, the merchant risk, and a lot of that is very inherent to infrastructure as an asset class, and energy it's not something new. It's not something about renewable. Maybe it is more pronounced there because of the issues around storage that you've mentioned. But how do you think the lessons that we've learned in terms of developing infrastructure as an asset class already apply to the sustainable angle here and to the renewable energy in particular? And what do you think are some good examples, perhaps, where this has worked well in terms of private and public sector working together on this and assuming part of the risk and encouraging the growth of the asset class?
Yeah, you are right. And I think that we have pretty good examples in the infra space in the past. And for sure, those should be a good guidance for the future in the renewable. We have seen in recent months corporates, big corporates, both in utilities, even former oil and gas, now energy companies, like BP or Total or Repsol of this world, committing just to do significant investments, some of them in these new technologies and in this new hydrogen, let's say, world, because it's clear that we need to invest in refineries, we need to invest in new sources of hydrogen technology just to ensure that we decrease the cost of production. And in that regards, there is a good dialogue between those private initiatives, those great corporates, obviously together with the different state governments and the European Union, just to ensure that they get the right balance in terms of public funding, either through equity, either through, let's say, cheap debt, subordinated debt, or some type of financing that at the end would complement the investment. It's something just to be decided, but it's clear that the dialogue is there, the commitment is there, the funds are, let's say, approved. So I'm sure that those PPP experience in the infra space in the past could be a good example for the future investments in these new technologies that would be required. And as I said, that are also quite embraced by the private sector, also getting at the end. What is clear is that we need to have a fair return for every party. And at the end, there will be discussions, there will be negotiation in terms of what would be the right mix between public and private funding. But I'm sure that there would be an agreement there because there is the opportunity for everyone.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. And speaking of the public sector, let me turn to you now, Mark, from the European Investment Bank, looking at, we've seen Europe make a big effort in terms of the Build Back Better agenda. The Recovery Fund is something that for years there has been discussion about the EU taking a more active role in terms of spending and supporting investment. And now we're finally seeing that absorption is still quite slow across the euro area. But there is also this agenda for the EIB to become Europe's climate bank. And you've done already a lot of work in the area of green finance. How do you see that from your perspective in terms of the issues that Daryl and Carlos have raised on the mix between public and private, but also on this idea of the transition and the right technology mix that we may be seeing, how we can arrive at that, how can we do it under different climate scenarios? The EIB has done a lot of work in terms of creating pipelines or investment projects, also on the issuing side of bonds supporting some of these renewable investments. But how can we also help other industries transition if in the energy space? So we heard from Carlos just now about some of the oil companies, for example. How do you see that from the EIB?
Hello, good morning. Thank you for having invited me in the panel. So first of all, maybe on the resilience of the infrastructure of the renewable assets as infrastructure in investment, I think what the crisis has shown is that renewable assets are very resilient, that all the projects by nature have been generating power even during crisis because the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. So this is a very resilient asset class in terms of generating revenues. But of course, we have also quite some risks there that have been mentioned before, especially the merchant risk. It is very difficult to forecast what will be the power price in the future. And we have seen several developments that we've been supporting as well in terms of corporate PPA between projects and off-takers, although those are quite limited today in Europe between project developers and utilities. And we have seen a few projects that have been signing corporate PPA with direct end users like Amazon or Google or Microsoft. But today it's still fairly limited in that sense. And we still see the big utilities doing the brokerage in between, either by contracting PPA from project themselves or by building themselves the projects and then structuring PPA for their clients. So it's starting, but it's not as big as it can be in the US, for example. So we still see the need here for some support from the public sector in terms of giving some risk sharing in terms of exposure to merchant price and the market, because that's what is holding many investors today is the future of prices and how much of the revenue those assets will generate. So we think that there will be still some need for this kind of support, and we can see that in Spain now when they are starting to set up those auctions, which we very welcome. We are already willing to see what it will look like, and this is why the European Union has been working a lot in setting high ambitious targets, and to meet those targets there will need to be this support. But it's not only about supporting power prices or supporting through CFD scheme, but it's also forcing states to set up the right framework to develop projects by setting up really high NECP target, National Energy Climate Plan targets of renewable energy in their energy matrix. It forces the state to establish a framework to do some preparatory work, strategic impact assessment, deciding on some development zone for offshore wind. So it forces the state to take action to make the framework available for private sector to invest in those projects in a secure way. So this is something we see as very important to have the framework, and we are helping actually some countries to do that by doing some workshop with, for example, we did one with Romania, with Bulgaria, to help them in exchanging ideas and best practice in order for them to implement actions in order to reach those targets in the long term. What we can also see then, and we discussed about it before, is the support to the technology development, because of course today we have incremental technology innovation, both in solar PV, mostly through more efficiency cells, but also what we start to see is bifacial. For example, in Spain, we start to see developers implementing projects with bifacial technologies. And of course, onshore wind, we see more and more the bigger turbines, and this requires some technological improvement in terms of material or even segmented blades. So they have some specific manufacturing system and erection system that allows them to bring a larger turbine. And this is especially interesting for repowering of existing sites. That's something we start to see more and more, because those existing sites are of course the ones with the best resources. They were the ones used first, but they had smaller turbines, not really so efficient. So a way to harvest better the resource is to repower them with larger turbines, for example, that we see a lot as well. And what we did also in technology development 10 years ago was to support broadly and heavily offshore wind in the North Sea, mostly in the north of Europe. And now what we start to do through some support mechanism as well is to support floating offshore, which is also a kind of new frontier for renewable energy. And it's a lot of potential there, both in terms of resources, because you can access better resources further from the coast, but also in terms of markets, where you can know with floating technology, you can access resources in the Mediterranean Sea, for example, or other places. So this allows to harvest more, and we are supporting that through some demonstration project as well. And the last thing on technology innovation, and this has been talked about regarding batteries and hydrogen. The European Commission is setting up an innovation fund that will be managed with the help of the EIB, let's say, for the technical expertise. And there will be several calls for tenders for every year for small project and big project for supporting projects that are not yet commercial, but to support their commercialization demonstration of the technology and bring them to the market. And this we see as very important, especially for the electrification, for the decarbonization in general, because the electrification itself will not be available for all the industries, and still some industries will need other ways of using renewable energy. And this could be through other energy vectors like hydrogen. Therefore, we need to support the technology development for this. Yes, I think that's...
And these plans for the Innovation Fund, I mean, Europe is very much ahead in this, but a lot of these technological developments are global. There is a kind of global science community that is working on that. How do you see the EU working with other regions in terms of the support of the technology that needs the state support in terms of innovation? And we are seeing also a change in the direction of policy in the US, which has been largely absent so far in terms of prioritizing the transition and the kind of sustainable nature of the recovery. So how do you see that kind of support to innovation being coordinated more globally would be one question. And then on your initial remarks about the PPA, the corporate PPA market and how it's developing, kind of where do you see that going, and what do you think the key kind of next steps would be in terms of creating more depth in that market?
Okay, yes, for the technology, I think on fundamental research and so very early development of technologies, there will be still a large cooperation among the regions of the world and all the scientists that will bring and develop a technology to a certain point where we move from a fundamental research to a more scaling up and demonstration of the technology. And that's where we think Europe will, at least our involvement will be more prominent rather than in pure research and development, although we finance also R&D for wind turbine manufacturer, for example. But the targeted support of the Innovation Fund is more related to bringing an existing idea to a commercial application and demonstrating that it's a viable solution in the short, medium term. And this will be mostly by, we see it mostly by European developers that will bring bricks of technologies from different places and put them together in order to bring a solution. And then we will then, as a EIB, support this kind of solution in order to demonstrate that this technology is available, that this can help the electricity supply and the renewable energy intermittency to be managed, and also to bring solution for the greenification of other sectors that cannot be electrified. So that's where we see we can really help because that's where our expertise rely in EIB in terms of project assessment, project development, not so much in terms of really fundamental research on long-term development of technologies. And with regard to the PPA market, this is something we really like to support. Like there is really a lot of emphasis in EIB to support projects that will get PPA. Today we can see them a bit in between, like I say, some corporate and direct PPA with projects, IPP project, let's say, from independent developers. But it's true that the market in Europe is still well concentrated with big powerhouses like the big utilities that still have a lot of market power in accessing clients. And they are a bit the best place to make this brokerage between an asset generating power and end user, because mostly of the difference of the profile of production and demand. And that's where you need some aggregator in the middle that can play this role. But we think that this PPA market will be able to develop further if we can support projects with some support mechanism, like I mentioned before, like CFD, auction, tender, that will enable project to start up and build them with some capacity reserved to the tender, some portion of it, maybe all of it, a portion of it reserved to this tender, and that will allow to the investor to have the security on his return by investing in those assets and getting this first chunk of revenues. And the other chunk of revenue may be then available and more available for structuring new kind of products for clients and PPAs. And also to get this investment in infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure, maybe through some support in the medium term, but that in 10 years will still be there and will be available then for a more mature market to be developed. So we try to trigger this. That's a bit our ideas.
Great, thank you. And I'm sure we'll return to kind of how that interaction is more optimally tweaked in terms of the support that institutions such as the EIB can offer. Let me turn to you now, Vicky, more on a kind of macro perspective. We heard a lot about this transition, the need to focus more on renewable energy and the kind of sustainable recovery. But what COVID has also introduces also this, which was there before, but it has kind of sharpened this awareness that crises such as this affect different parts of society differently, and there is also the need to focus the transition on not just being sustainable with regards to the environment, but also in terms of being a just transition, and a lot of jobs that may be displaced by the shift to more renewable forms of infrastructure and energy. How do we ensure that also comes with the economic growth for developing countries as well, that may be perhaps less advanced in that journey, but also in terms of the labor market mix for countries that have been reliant on non-renewable energy in terms of exports and so on. How do you see that for the macroeconomic side? Is it a question of, because we're already starting to see some opposition in even renewable energy? Mark was mentioning, offshore wind or solar, and public attitudes saying, well, we don't want that in our backyard, and there is that side of it as well. So how do you see that?
Well, thank you very much, Danai. These are very important issues, and I really enjoyed listening to what people are saying. I think the thing to bear in mind is that there is going to need to be a very important shift away from the way we do things now to doing things, very, very differently in the future. And if indeed we do believe the figures that are coming out, the International Renewables Energy Agency has calculated that what we need just in this decade to 2030 is a shift away from fossil fuel investment to renewable ones of the tune of $10 trillion. Now, that is quite a large sum. And even if we add all the bits that the EIB may be doing, if we add all the bits that the UK had just announced, what the US perhaps may be doing in the future, and what, of course, we hear also from Japan and others, we are just not going to get there just on that. The shift is very, very significant. And what we were hearing earlier about the public-private partnership is a very important one. But at the same time, what you need to do is shift the sort of impression that people have that this is going to be pretty bad. And of course, even the European Green Deal and this just transition mechanism that they put in place takes into account the fact that there are going to be lots of displaced people as a result. And that's going to be particularly bad for the number of areas around the world which rely very, very directly and quite substantially on the type of industry which is very fossil fuel dependent. We're talking about a large part of the developing world. And those are also areas where energy demand is going to come back again. Yes, of course, it slowed down with COVID, but it will come back. Certainly by the middle of this decade, we expect that it will all have come back and to where it was before, if not, in fact, earlier, depending, of course, on what happens to the vaccine. And something has to be still there to meet that type of energy demand. And the move from where we are now to where we'd like to be is actually very significant in terms of the actual investment it requires. And we can look at the various bits of the energy sector right now and what, of course, that might mean and what, of course, it will mean for some of the countries. I mean, right now, we talked about solar, of course, and also hydropower. Hydropower does indeed account for about 16% of global electricity. But if you look at other areas, such as wind, that's 5%. Solar, it's 2%. There will need to be a very, very significant shift to get to where you want, because solar in particular is now looked at as being the area where perhaps we can get one of the biggest sort of returns from it, because of course the cost is going down, but it needs to be quite generally accepted that that's where we move to. And if we are to move to net zero by 2050, which of course is what a number of countries are pledging, and also in China we have 2060 as the net zero. But nevertheless, what you need is to reduce emissions from coal powered fire stations by 75% by 2030. I mean, that's enormous. And if you were to move to electric cars, which is one of the main areas where you can, again, in transport, reduce the need for fossil fuel power, if you like, for it, then you need, by 2030, 50% of all new cars across the world to be, according to the IEA, to be sold as electric cars. And that, of course, requires a huge investment in battery production, not just improving it, of course, which will be very, very useful, but just the actual capacity needs to apparently double every 2 years in order to be able to meet that demand. That requires quite a big shift in terms of what we're doing right now. And the IMF itself has produced in a blog just the last few days quite a warning note saying it actually takes a long time for the transition from coal to something else. So just looking at some examples, of course, the UK has done it rather well, I have to say. But nevertheless, it just tracks what has been happening in particular times and also in particular regions, and how slow that transition has been in the past, and what the impact of that transition, even if it is achievable, can have on traditional industries and things that people actually depend on. So you asked Danai about employment. The extraordinary thing is that we have just announced this 12-point, or is it 10-point plan? The 12 refers to the amount of money, by the way. 10-point plan in the UK in terms of achieving net zero pretty quickly and reducing our emissions quite significantly. The Climate Change Committee has produced their 6th carbon budget, which is recommending that we should be reducing our emissions by 80% compared to 1990 levels by 2035, which is much, much faster than the 2050 goal we had before. The amount of money that was put aside, or at least pledged, not even put aside, pledged by the government, of course it will attract quite a lot of extra money, hopefully, by the private sector, was just 12 billion pounds. Now, I refer to the 10 trillion that is required globally, but the UK, of course, is a small part and becoming smaller, leaving the EU in a way. But it's still very, very small what it is that we are pledging. And there are serious concerns that the public side of this investment, yes, it might encourage all sorts of things, may just not materialize. And a lot of what the EU is worried about is giving support for employment, for social changes that might take place. Politics will be in danger if there is such a rapid change that affects the people who depend on energy coming into their houses and find that it could perhaps get more expensive. And the interesting thing is, in today's or yesterday's papers here in the UK, there was the real warning as a result of the Climate Change Committee's report that just insulating your home or changing your boilers could cost you an extra £8,000 per household and more, because there are going to be all these extra issues that you have to worry about, damp because you're going to use a different source of electricity for your house, etc. Moving away from gas, which has been the most common way of doing it. So there has to be a change in attitude as well, and a change in support as in order to get that change in attitude coming from the government. So it's not just investing in new technologies and helping the efforts being made by the private sector, and also, of course, making it that way a lot more sustainable as an investment asset. But also it is investing quite significantly in encouraging those attitudes to become quite ingrained and acceptable, and doing something in relation to people changing jobs and needing new skills to move into these new areas. And the last point that I would make is that actually this behavioral change is a very significant part of what the IEA and others are assuming will happen in order to meet those net zero targets. Without those behavioral changes, we're still going to be lagging hugely behind. But the jobs, you asked about the jobs, we are in a COVID crisis. Everyone is looking at a way of getting more jobs created in the future. If you look again at the 10-point plan of Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, he's assuming that as a result of the amount he's going to be spending, this 12 billion plus whatever comes from the private sector, which he hopes will be multiplying this by quite significantly, in fact, there will be an extra 225,000 jobs created. Now that is nothing by comparison to what a country like this needs. We are losing 250,000 retail jobs just this year. The promise of green actually being something that creates the extra growth and jobs for you needs to be worked on hugely by policymakers to make that acceptable. The EU, I think, is moving in the right direction by directing a lot of the recovery funds, once they come, into green areas and looking at what it might do in terms of carbon prices and also carbon border adjustment mechanism. That will, of course, be negative for loads of developing countries, but at least it is suggesting that there is, a lot of effort being put into making this whole issue quite acceptable and hopefully positive in terms of sustainable growth for those economies that absolutely need it. My worry is that we're still going to, nevertheless, across the world, have a huge job to do to make it A, acceptable, and B, believable. In other words, seriously using it to create new jobs, which may just not happen. You may need something additional, in fact, a lot of extra spending that needs to come to ensure that whatever jobs are lost as a result of this transition, it is just and that those jobs can be recovered in other ways. It won't happen by just investing in the green economy is the concern that I have looking at the data that exists at present. But things, of course, could change, and hopefully people on the panel will tell me something different.
Thank you very much, Vicky, kind of tempering our expectations and our optimism there, and very important to look also at the labor market. Just to follow up on that and kind of what you said, if we end up in a situation where not all of the loss of the jobs that have been lost due to COVID can be replaced through this green transition, of course it is a good thing that some jobs are being created, and great to hear all these efforts that the UK government is doing in this and also the EU. But how do you think we may end up in a situation where we've had trade wars before, currency wars? Will it be transition wars now in terms of who can benefit the most out of this? Which are the winning technologies and who has most access to it? How do we ensure there is global cooperation in that, and also in the new phase with the UK and the EU? And we were talking before, I mentioned the previous panel about the UK and Spain working on this very closely together. How can we ensure that these benefits we do not end up in a competitive environment in a negative sense?
Well, cooperation is key, and I think that's been discussed before, and I think you're absolutely spot on there. Without that, it just won't work. Number one. Number two, we're going to have to accept that there has to be this huge transfer of funds to developing nations, which are going to absolutely need it. And that had been the agreement originally. With the Paris Agreement, the idea had been that there would be this transfer. Very little of that has happened. So I'm afraid that is absolutely required in order to make sure that a part of the world where energy demands are going to be rising very, very significantly is also able to switch to something which is globally acceptable as well in terms of what it might do to climate change and the temperature increases that we want to keep to just the 1.5 centigrade increase rather than anything more. So very little of that money has been transferred, and I think that type of cooperation needs to be rethought and needs to be done in a clever way, and without working together, we might as well forget it. And we talk about a carbon tax. We're still miles away from having achieved it and putting a proper price on carbon. But as I said, that of course will have huge impacts on some parts of the world, and it needs to be thought out carefully.
Thanks, Vicky. Yes, there's a whole new discussion about the carbon tax, and there are some questions from the audience on that, so we can return to it later on. But let me turn to Ayush now, last but definitely not least. From the OECD, you have the kind of green finance center there, and how do you see the issues that have been raised so far in terms of, there's been a big discussion about the need for the role of policy in that, and working together with the private sector. How do you see that from the perspective of the OECD, and also the issue that Vicky has raised just now about the need for even more spending, even more aggressive kind of investment in that direction?
Well, thank you, Danae, and thanks for having me here today, and thank you to all of the panelists for having really open up the conversation on such a broad canvas. I'd like to come in on 2 points, as you mentioned. The first is around the role of policymakers in creating an enabling environment. And the second is the role of policymakers in mobilizing institutional investors and private capital more broadly, both of which are critical if the renewable industry is to graduate to an asset class. And I will treat these in broad strokes, and hopefully we can delve into some of the specifics later in the discussion. So taking a step back, a year into the pandemic, where do we find ourselves? What is the state of play of the renewables industry globally? We know that after a brief slowdown in the first half of this year, activity has rebounded. Project developers across the world, with differences between jurisdictions, but largely have been accelerating their project developments. A lot of pre-pandemic capacity is now coming online. And even though installations in 2020 will be lower than that of 2019, the IEA forecasts that wind and solar together are poised to overtake gas and coal in the near future in terms of total installed capacity. Investor sentiment has been positive, has been on the rise. If you look at the fundraising activity, despite the economic headwinds from the pandemic, fundraising for renewables and green infrastructure more broadly has been on a steady upwards trajectory. So this is all to say quickly that despite the economic fallout of 2020, the long-term prospects of the sector appear to be bright, which is great news. But while investors can handle and manage the economic uncertainty of a pandemic, what is a lot harder to navigate are the uncertainties around policy. So reneging of contracts, renegotiation of tariffs from India to France, letting incentives expire without further visibility, like in Vietnam, China, or even the United States, continuing to directly or indirectly subsidize fossil fuel, coal, like in many Southeast Asian economies. These are all instances of policies that hamstring the growth of the sector. So what should policymakers do? It is imperative that policymakers provide a clear, predictable, and transparent policy framework that allows the origination of bankable projects while addressing the financing and capacity issues, the challenges around project preparation, because we know that it is not a question of an absence of capital. As we've heard during this panel, there is investor appetite, there is capital. But if you only just look at the dry powder in the funds industry, it clearly tells you where the bottleneck lies. It is an absence of a pipeline of investment grade projects. So what do governments, and this involves what Daryl was mentioning about governments needing to set clear frameworks to channel capital towards the new technologies that are needed. So what should the governments do? In our work and advice at the OECD, we advocate for an integrated approach to policy design. We espouse something called a whole of government approach, which at its core is the practice of taking a transversal approach to core policies of a sector to do 3 things: to identify unintended consequences, to identify misalignments, but also potential for synergy. So in terms of renewables, the 5 policy areas that must be looked at together, regardless of which jurisdiction, and taken a systemic view of, are your policies around investment, your financial regulation, competition, investment promotion and facilitation, and sectoral planning and governance. That is one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is the imperative to mobilize private capital. Now, even before the pandemic, in many jurisdictions, public debt levels were quickly approaching their ceiling, and the fiscal space was increasingly constrained. The pandemic has only exacerbated that in emerging, developing, and advanced economies alike. In this context, it is ever more important that limited public funds be used in a manner that is judicious and optimizes the leverage of private capital. So in that regard, institutional investors, and we work with, and not just the OECD, but a lot of organizations have spent quite some time in trying to understand how can institutional investors be brought into critical infrastructure development. In OECD and G20 countries alone, institutional investors provide over $69 trillion in assets, but their allocation to infrastructure is on real economy assets is a fraction. And their allocation to renewables is, in fact, our research shows much lower than what it can actually be. So when it comes to the policymakers' role in mobilizing and increasing and upscaling this investment, in the arsenal of mobilizing investment, there are broadly 2 kinds of approaches. The first is around de-risking tools and techniques. So aggregating, warehousing, blending, cornerstone stakes at fund level, like the EU's Innovation Fund, but also active risk management at the project level. In a sense, deploying public capital to crowd and private finance. The second kind of approaches are around policy, which so in the larger context of the cross-cutting assessment of policy I was talking about, it can range from and must range from revisiting capital requirements, the capital charge for infrastructure projects for banks, all the way to allowing financial innovation, leveraging the certain trends in the financial industry today, allowing things like securitized products and structured vehicles that can leverage the trends in passive investing, that can leverage the fact that many jurisdictions are shifting from defined benefit to defined contribution plans, which completely changes the way that capital will be allocated. And just understanding that by using financial innovation, you deepen your capital markets, but you also expand the investor base that you have for infrastructure development. So I'm going to stop right there, and maybe we can delve into some of the details going further. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Ayush. And I think the issue that you raised about the kind of pipeline of projects that governments need to have is really a crucial one. It keeps coming up again and again in these conversations we're having as part of the Sustainable Policy Institute. The appetite is there, as you said, the investor demand is there, but how do we actually translate that into projects that can be financed? And perhaps you can tell us a little bit about some examples in that area, kind of what has worked well, the framework of the OECD that you described, how has it been applied, some kind of governments that you have seen make that progress in that direction, and how others can learn from that. And also on what you were raising just now towards the end about the kind of financial structure around these assets. There was a question from the audience, and we will move now into the Q&A session, which says that renewables are still treated unfairly by financial institutions and interest rates are high. So how can financial institutions be incentivized for easier borrowing? So these two questions on kind of the government and then the financial institutions.
Sure. So around the question of creating project pipelines, I think, of course, it's a domestic context specific issue, but there are certain broad things that governments need to look out for, which comes to transparency. You need to have a champion a cross-cutting committee that acts a clear champion that creates and procures infrastructure. There needs to be a public funding envelope attached to your project pipeline. And project pipelines need to be what we call dynamically adaptable, which essentially is and this is a concept that's used in water management from Bangladesh to New Zealand. When it comes to managing your water infrastructure, trying to create a clear, because there is a lot of uncertainty. But the investors are not asking for a clear, a rigid plan. They want to have visibility, to commit the time, effort, and capital that is needed to get into some of these markets. So having a plan that provides clear triggers, having a plan that analyzes multiple scenarios and has clear trigger points that tells you that if something will come to pass, this is the glide path of the policy, so to speak. A framework like that, which of course needs to be developed with key ministries coming together. A lot of the problem with many governments, and this is a less more amplified in developing and emerging economies, is that ministries don't talk to each other. And there needs to be, we're breaking down problems into silos. But the problems that we're facing today in the context of a larger transition, we need to put the pieces together. It needs to be opened up, looked at together. There are multiple perspectives, and everybody, not just the public and the private sector, but public sector, public authorities, different ministries, sectoral authorities needs to speak among themselves to come together to create a clear framework and then speak to the private sector. So it's not just a public-private conversation, it's also a public-public conversation that needs to happen. On the question of financial instruments, our work has recently shown that, as I was talking about, there's a shift in the way, in the pension industry from defined benefit to defined contribution. The very way that these large chunks of capital, people's savings are going to be deployed is being changed. And there has to be commensurate development in the financial sector from the policy side, because a lot of the governments are still extremely conservative with their financial policies. In many instruments, there's a huge disparity between the kind of instruments that are used in some of the advanced economies and the absence of some of the basic instruments all the way to simple project finance structures in some of the economies in Asia and Africa, for instance. And that disparity is key. It is key in the sense because a lot of the returns that will come in renewable energy projects will shift from the western part of the world to the part where there is more demand, where there is more market. But then there are challenges there. There are challenges of scale. There are challenges in a lot of the countries in Africa and Asia. Utility scale projects are not as feasible. What you need are decentralized solutions, but they don't work for large ticket acquisitions. They don't work for institutional investors. And what you need is a targeted mechanisms to address specific policies, specific issues like this. On the question of renewables being treated unfairly, again, I want to link it back to the fact that it is a domestic context specific. In a lot of the countries where there is scale, there are projects of currency, there are issues of currency hedging, which almost doubles the cost of the project. So, and when the investors factor that in, it increases the cost of capital and affects the economics of the business. So this is all to say that there is a clear, very clear role for the policymakers, and it is great to see that there's appetite in the financial sector. And of course, the financial sector is innovating, but there needs to be a more clear, more experimental, audacious approach. And I will just end with this, because we have known for a while, Danae, that there is a problem of investment grade projects. We've known for a while, there have been multiple reports for at least 5 years, if not more, that there's an issue of bankable projects. We know the solutions. We know the policies that need to be retooled. We know capital charge is a problem. We know there are certain policies in the insurance and the pension sector that hamstring and withhold these investors from coming in. We need to be audacious enough to take out our toolkit and rework it. And that, in my opinion, is a very critical first step and a long needed one. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ayush. That's in a good place. At least we know kind of what needs to be fixed, and now it's the difficult task of doing that. Carlos, I don't know if you want to come in on this question as well about the treatment of renewables by financial institutions, and give us perhaps also your perspective from Spain on this.
Yeah, sure. No, I do agree. No, I think that for me, honestly, the question that you mentioned, that it was coming from the public, was a bit surprising, because my feeling, and honestly my knowledge, is that there is a lot of liquidity in the market coming from the banks and also from financial investors that has been specialized in providing debt. So in that regard, really, I haven't seen any project that has not have access to financing, and I would say to achieve financing. No? We are talking about long-term projects, but at the end you need to commit long-term capital, and that means that obviously pricing could be, I don't know, is a margin of 150 basis points, 200 basis points. So, and when you apply that to the Euribor level, it's honestly something that for sure would not kill any project. And we are talking also about a size of the debt that goes between 70 to 80% of the project. So when you look at all the figures, honestly, I don't perceive, and I haven't seen any project that has not had access to the financing, and also at pretty, I would say, cheap or non-expensive conditions. Obviously, you need to get a good sponsor, you need to get a good project, you need to get certainty and visibility of the future cash flows. That's for sure part of the name of the game. But from a, let's say, a point of view of necessity, just to continue developing the renewables in the future, I don't see this really a weakness, at least in Eastern countries or OECD countries, and obviously in Spain, in the UK, and European Union, or the things in Asia or Africa, that obviously the challenges are quite different than here. No? So the banks, honestly, are quite competitive, and we are competing with each other just to get part of the financing. There were significant offshore wind financing during the COVID situation, when there was, let's say, this sense of lack of liquidity in the bank market, and the support obviously of the European banks and Central Europe and the Fed in the USA. And one example is FECAN, no, with EDF as the sponsor, and they were able just to really to get the financing at similar conditions of a project that was before signed in November with a different project. So my sense is that for sure there is a debate with the European Central Bank in terms of what would be the consumption of capital for these, let's say, green projects in general, not only about renewables, but also in terms of sustainable projects it would require a lower consumption of capital. That could mean a reduction on the spreads that could be applied to the different projects. And this debate is there, but we need also to get to be sure that we are not assuming excessive risk there, not because at the end it's not just because it's green and sustainable, it's better. It's obviously it's good for the society, it's good for many things, but from a risk profile point of view, we need to be sure that also it's also as sustainable sustainable for the society, you know. So in that regard, my point here would be as a summary that there is plenty of liquidity from the banking community, from the financial sponsor community, and at quite competitive terms. And for me, the key point is just to have a strong project, well structured and well defined with a strong sponsor.
Great, thank you, Carlos. And if anyone else wants to come on this question, please raise your hand. But in the meantime, there is another question on the role of institutional investors and how they can evaluate new technologies and decide which ones are investable and which not, and how that kind of process happens. Perhaps one for you, Daryl, and if others want to come in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So first thing I'd say is obviously a number of different features there. So I guess the question aims at, how do you assess the actual technology? First and foremost, there is the point we spend a lot of time discussing across panelists, which is the framework it sits in. I think the feeling of you have to start from the idea that a particular host government has a clear policy support and guidance to support that technology. I think trying to do something on an entrepreneurial manner, should we say, isn't going to work on that basis. You've got to understand it fits within the objectives of the government. Then it comes to, I guess, where the question has come from, which is how do you assess that technology? That's a difficult one that sort of Mark alluded to, which is the idea of when you go from small scale technologies to large scale, can it be delivered? That's the sort of classical kind of credit approach. Reality is, institutions, like many banks, will outsource a lot of that. That will come down to, what diligence is possible to do. It will then come down to the assessment of whether that risk and return is appropriate. So there is a manner to actually bridge that. But I think for me, the most important thing is understanding alignment. And one of the points a number of governments do pick up is that if there is strong policy support, or in some cases, public sector capital, and that can be the EIB in that context, or it can be from host governments, that can arguably crowd in capital. So it's maybe that's the wrong way of looking at it, but I think reality is institutions will feel much more comfortable seeing alignment than being left to do something on their own. So I think there is a way in which you can try and create this sort of win-win by crowding in public and private sector interests.
Can I just add, this is very much what we were discussing before, just very quickly. I mean, if you look at what the UK is supposed to be doing, if you look at, again, at the Climate Change Committee and what they've been recommending in terms of how much needs to be spent every year, they're suggesting that you need 50 billion a year in order to get, between now and certainly the end of this decade, in order to get to your net zero, if that is indeed what the government is planning. So obviously any investor will need to be sure, as I was suggesting earlier, that some of the public sector investment commitment is there and will be coming. And for the moment, the plans have been criticised that the government has come out with as to not providing enough backing, not really being detailed enough, and certainly where is the extra money going to come from if it's needed. So this institutional framework is absolutely essential for any investment, particularly in this area. One guesses, even though there are obviously huge opportunities for whoever is investing in it, but you do require to see that the government here is committed properly. And so far, I think when you look at what is required and what is actually being offered, it still needs a bit of work to be done. Once it's made into proper law, which is the way that we work here, then some of that help has to come in order to achieve those targets, which is the way that the carbon budgets are set out in this country anyway.
Great, thanks, Vicky. And let me turn to you, Mark, as well on this question of alignment that Daryl has raised on kind of setting the direction, and then the private sector can follow. And there's also a question from the audience around how governments can incentivize this transition to renewables, for example, through a carbon tax or through making coal plants illegal in some locations. So kind of how do you see that more interventionist action directing the growth of the renewables market?
Yes, first to come back on the pipeline of projects that we were discussing, and I think this is linked to your question. What we've seen, for example, outside of Europe and that we are financing in terms of framework is an initiative from the World Bank, like Scaling Solar, that is trying to set up exactly this kind of framework to trigger the private investment in projects, in renewable projects. It has been working, maybe not, it did not scale up as quickly as they were thinking probably, but it's working, and we've financed a few projects on that basis. And this is forcing governments to really think about the framework and set it up to attract the investment. And inside Europe, in terms of project development and project pipeline, of course, there is also the issue of the geography and natural resources distribution. So you don't get the same resources in Spain than in Hungary, for example. But what the Commission is working on is to try to set up, the European Commission is trying to set up EU tenders, where you could, for example, source some of your renewable energy targets from other countries and cross-subsidize among countries, so that you can, by supporting a project in Spain, meet your target in Hungary, and this kind of mechanism. So there's really something that public sector and the politicians are aware of, how to really bring those projects up and create the interest in them. With regard to the question about what could do government to trigger more those investment and the coal issue, it's not only actually what is being implemented is really this. At some point, all the coal plants will have to close because the targets are so ambitious that implicitly it's going to be closed, either by the government because they need to meet the targets, but also we see utilities like Iberdrola, for example, in Spain, that were even willing to close their coal plant before the government allowed them to do, for security of supply reasons. So this comes back to the ESG question we were talking at the beginning. At this stage, it's questionable if you still need a lot of support to convince corporates that they need to turn green. The pressure from the stakeholders and the market is so high that many companies are already changing their target. And okay, we discussed this at the beginning, and I did not pick it up for the oil and gas company. They are also trying to move that way. What we need to avoid, of course, is greenwashing. So we need to be very careful about what is really there, what is their decarbonization plan, is it real or not? And of course, we want to support them, but we also get in EIB a question from our member state in the board on what is your approach in financing green projects from brown companies? What is going to be the framework? And we are working on that. And this is very important. But at this stage, yes, the commitment that the states have taken in line with the NECPs is so high that it will translate automatically in this kind of action, yes.
Great, thank you, Mark. And Daryl, you have your hand up. You have the last word as we're coming to the close of this panel.
Well, thank you. It is an important point because it comes to Vicky's point, so hopefully it's a good way to end. I think what's really important is to recognise, certainly in the context of developed markets and in Europe, the consumer will be paying. So Vicky's point around is really important because it is the general public. And at the end of the day, this will either be paid for by the taxpayer or the consumer. Energy generally is a consumer-funded business. And so therefore, engagement with the public is really important. To make that investment that Vicky spoke about is going to need public to understand that we won't get to net zero without an impact to them. And I think the impact on the consumer, we have to be very, very sensitive to. I think one of the things I would say from institutional points of view, and it goes to the very good point from OECD about DC pension schemes, is that we need a world where, as someone who is saving for their pensions or is a pensioner, there's a virtuous circle of that money being utilised for renewable energy for a better world. So I think there's a narrative here between the impact to consumer and the impact on our savings that needs to be elevated. But that's a sort of higher level position.
Great, thanks, Daryl, for raising that. Certainly a lot of, we were talking in the beginning how we've kind of done the awareness raising part for the investors at least, and now the incentives are there and it's about implementation, but maybe there's still a lot of the communication to be done with the general public and the consumer. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you very much, all of our panelists. I'd now like to hand over to His Excellency the Ambassador of the UK to Spain and Andorra, Hugh Elliott, to offer us some closing remarks.
Hi there, Danae. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Hello.
Great. Thanks very much. Well, thank you. Thanks, Danae. Thanks to my team, to Michelle and the team. Thanks to Onfir. Thanks very much to all the panelists. It's been a fascinating discussion. I mean, the last thing you want at the end of a discussion like this is some sort of institutional speech from an ambassador, so I'm not going to give you one. But what I will do, because I haven't been able to listen to the whole discussion, unfortunately, but I've listened to different elements of it, and it is absolutely fascinating because there is such a world of opportunity here. There is such a pressing policy, societal, environmental, and indeed sort of survival need. And there are some really quite clear challenges that you have all been discussing and setting out, which are there, but which we seem to understand from your expertise, panelists, we seem to understand really quite well. And so I would just reflect that that if we have that depth of understanding between the UK and Spain, which is obviously the particular perspective that I bring to this, the thing I would flag is that there is such a huge clarity of policy priority, not I can completely understand of all the detailed things that need to flow from that necessarily in order for the investment that you are discussing to be rolled out at the speed that we currently think that we do need to roll them out. But there is that policy ambition there. And I saw that from here when Spain decided that at the last minute it was going to host the COP25 here in Madrid. I see that all the time in everything I get coming in from the UK government about our ambition about how important tackling the climate change agenda is for us generally. For obviously Glasgow puts it on the map really seriously. We've got the Climate Ambition Summit, which is going to be a really important staging point to keep the world's ambition going on this on as I say, on Sunday the 12th, 5 years on from Paris. I think I reflect, and taking some of Vicky's very clear challenges there, I think I would reflect from my time in the private sector that there is never quite the clarity or framework that you want from governments for any kind of investments, is there? So to a degree that there's a leap of faith that you need to make, and indeed in that leap of faith lies the risk and the risk premium as well. So it lies the opportunity. And so I think what I would say is, and I'm not sure who it was who mentioned just quite a moment ago, the decision by Iberdrola to get out ahead of the policy agenda with closing a power plant in a coal-fired power station in Spain, even before it was supposed to be doing so, is a clear example of where industry can actually read policy signals and make its own decisions on the back of them and try to take these opportunities. So I'm optimistic that those sort of very strong policy signals are only going one way. I mean, we've seen the way that the UK has probably been mentioned. We've seen the way that the UK has sort of increased its level of ambition, accepting more clarity needed about precisely how that's going to be delivered, but increased its level of ambition to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What the latest figure you all know, 68% by 2030, hugely challenging. And I'm aware too from friends and indeed relatives in the sector of the challenges in terms of things like capacity. I'm aware of the bottlenecks. I mean, the largest electrolyzer in the world, if we're talking hydrogen, is I think 20 megawatts. And that is nowhere near what we're going to need. And we're going to need very, very soon if we're going to take advantage just of that one specific piece of technology, which will be, a key part of the mix. So all I would say by the end of this is thank you very much for joining us for this debate. It's really, really important. It's going to be a very important part of our work here in our teams in the embassy to promote UK-Spain investment into renewable energy, to do our best to continue that discussion, understand what the blocks are, help our respective governments develop their policy responses, and help businesses find their way, chart their way through this very rapidly developing policy space, so that those investments can be made in the challenging timeframes that we absolutely need them. So I will say no more than that. Thank you very much, everybody, for having participated. I'm really grateful and look forward to continuing this discussion. We're going to be lots more like this.